Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How you doing, Ken?
I'm well. Thank you for asking, Rory. I'm delighted to be here. Both Rory and I are delighted you've joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. You've caught us at episode 256. Three stops on today's journey, starting off with theory in practice, where we look at how theory applies itself in the counselling or therapy room. Today, we're going to be speaking about something that I think applies to anyone, whether you're a student, whether you're in practice, no matter what your modality, and that is building rapport. How do we do that? How important is that? What does the what does the research tell us about that? Then moving on to practice today, where we look at something that is contemporary, something that is going on now. It can be a win, it can be a challenge faced by counselors and psychotherapists. And today we're going to be speaking about transitional objects. And then we go into Practice Matters. That is the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And today, an interview with Sean Connolly, TEAM CBT. So that's worth keeping your ear to the speaker for, Rory.
Absolutely, Ken.
Yes. So kicking us off, we start off with that theory in practice, building rapport.
Yes, it's really interesting, and I think possibly just touch on the theory first before we go any further. It's been long known. There's been lots of research, and one of the research we talked about this a lot in the Counselling Tutor Podcast is something called common factors. And common factors are the ingredients, if you like, of what makes a successful outcome or what can lead to successful outcome in counselling and psychotherapy for the client. And one of those is the relationship. You know, the relationship is a big ingredient in that therapeutic mix. And one of the ways that we develop the relationship is building a rapport. And I think it's kind of like, for me, building a rapport is like a kind of, I would call it both knowing. So an example of rapport, certainly in the UK, and I don't know how this transposes to other countries, but you can guarantee you can get a conversation anywhere on the street in the UK if you just say to someone, what do you think about the weather? And before long, people will chat about the weather, and you can get a commonality with someone. You can find common ground, a neutral common ground, and then you can develop and start to build, if you want, a relationship. Sometimes it's called icebreakers, but a rapport means that you're kind of giving yourself a little bit of yourself to another person, and they're giving a little bit of their self to you. It's a starting point, I think, Ken.
It is, and it's a relational condition, rapport. So I think of being maybe in a store, and you've just gone in to have a browse around, and then maybe a sales assistant might walk up to you and say, "Can I help you with anything?" Very often we might be, unless we have something specific we need help with, we might say, "No, thanks, I'm just looking," and think very little of it and carry on. And that is an incident where no rapport exists. Now, if the person that walked up to us was known to us, maybe a next door neighbor or somebody we knew from a social club, and they walked up and said, "Hey, how are you doing? Is there anything I can help you with today?" The interaction would be very, very different. And that is because there is a built rapport. There is a shared understanding, a knowledge of one another. I guess it becomes the grease that oils the wheels of a relationship. Relationships are built on rapport. And of course, the outcome of rapport is more willingness to share. I might be more willing to share something with somebody that I've known for a few years and built a rapport with than I would be to a total stranger who asks me about how I am or who I am. I'd share more with somebody that I share rapport with. Trust is built via rapport. And all of these kind of become the foundations of what counseling is about. We build counseling on the relationship. We want a trusting relationship, want a threat-free relationship where the client feels free to share, does not feel judged. And that all starts with that building of that rapport.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And it can just be small things. I mean, here in the UK, we have a cultural kind of precedent where we would offer someone a warm drink. It's always been my experience that if you meet someone, they say, "Do you fancy a cup of tea?" Or certainly from the north of the country, they'd say, "Fancy a brew." And what you do when someone offers you a brew, you're going to be on the right side of things. I think it starts with that when you meet the client, you might say, how did you get here? And you might say, I got on the bus, or I drove, or I cycled. And you can say, oh yeah, and I, when I was practicing, I used to say that road can be really busy. And you go, oh yeah, I nearly got, I nearly missed the turning. I'm always doing that. And before long, you're starting in a social dialogue, a very neutral, very safe social dialogue, but one that shows that you're interested in the other, that you're listening. You're beginning that process of saying, I'm listening to you. And also they're getting to know you. Very important. And I love them. I love the reference to the grease that oils the wheels of a relationship. It's absolutely that. It's a huge grease gun. Yeah.
Yeah. And now we think about, so there's a little bit of theory on rapport. And when we look to what the research suggests that no matter what the modality, the outcomes of therapy are very much based on the relational element of the therapeutic process. Is who you are to that client, who they are to you, and that trust and I guess that rapport that exists. So Rory and I share rapport. We've known each other for many years, and we're able to speak easily. We're able to speak freely when we do things like the Counselling Tutor Podcast. But we can have it. So how does this show when it shows itself in therapy? We can have a client who comes in, those first sessions, maybe rapport hasn't been built. Maybe they are I guess apprehensive to start sharing their pain, their life secrets. They might come in, they might say things like, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know what's expected of me. I've never been in therapy before. And I think that patience is part of rapport. I think that just reflecting back and welcoming a person warmly can form part of rapport. We may say something in reply to that, like, that's not uncommon, that somebody might come in and not know what to talk about. Are there any questions you have for me that would clarify that for you? It's a welcoming kind of looking to let that person feel at ease. And of course, rapport works both ways. It's kind of an invisible force. You may feel the rapport building in yourself towards that client as well, that you speak easier to them as that rapport begins to build. So Rory, what are some of the other techniques or ways that we might build rapport, specifically right in those beginning stages where a client might be a little apprehensive? And you've already mentioned, how did you get here today? How was the traffic today? Mentioning the weather, asking them if they'd like a drink. That, of course, goes to start building that rapport. Any other things we can do if that person feels shy or a little reserved in those early sessions, Rory?
Yeah, well, I mean, seating is always a rapport building exercise, I think. Nowadays, I would say to a client, where would you like to sit? And they might say, I'll sit near the door. And I'll go, oh, okay, then you sit near the door. So you're already building rapport. And I think one other interesting one, and it's interesting we do this this piece of skills theory today, because I can remember my lesson in my introduction class on rapport, and one of the things that the tutor said was that she was working with a client, and the client said, I'm getting divorced, and the tutor said, as her therapist, I've got that T-shirt. And I think what can happen is you can just give a little bit, just a tiny bit of self-disclosure to say that you're tuned in, and it speaks, I think, Ken, to attunement therapeutic, empathy and attunement, doesn't it?
I like that. Yes. So appropriate self-disclosure. And I like how you did that, Rory. You kind of, you threw in the story of the example, of course, but it's just a small sentence that's thrown in. It doesn't take it away from what that person is bringing. No. It just says, I see you, I hear you, I recognize you. And I think another element of rapport is our non-verbal communication as well. So rapport is not just what we say with our words. It is the how we hold our face, how we look at that client, how we nod, how we use those non-verbal affirmations that we are there. Maybe we're leaning slightly forward as the person is speaking to show, I'm interested in what it is that you are saying. And all of that builds that rapport. And I guess, rapport is something we can practice. You can practice it in your everyday life outside of the counseling room. Just in your day to day, when you're next at the tills at a supermarket and somebody's helping you, you can ask how their day was, what time they started, what time they're going off, all kinds of questions, and just practice that little bits of rapport building. And I've certainly found in my own life, I practice that. I'm neurodiverse. I'm autistic, so there are parts of me that struggle, I guess, with social interactions. So I purposely put myself in positions where I might go out and build rapport in my day-to-day life as kind of flexing that muscle, as it were. So we've spoken a little bit about rapport. We've kind of said how we might say that, or how we might show that in our way of being. What might we do? And this is interesting here. What might we do if we feel that rapport is not being built? So we're kind of there with that client and we're just not feeling it, and we can maybe sense that they're not feeling it as well. How might we work with that, Rory?
Well, I think that sometimes just being open and honest is the best policy. Open and honest.
Yeah.
I know there's been times where I've said to clients, and certainly when I was a school counsellor to younger clients, because there's a big age difference between my clients and myself at the time, and I would say I just wonder, it just feels, it feels a little tense maybe. I just wonder if it's something I'm doing, and by kind of putting it onto you and putting the focus onto you, what can happen is that they go, well, not really, but, are you an older guy? And, and before long, you could start to say, oh, yeah, I must look really old to you. And they go, well, actually, yes. What I used to say is, well, how old do you think I am? And he used to go, well, I think you're 42. And I go, well, I'm 50. And he go, really? And before long, you're away. It's a kickstart, you're away. And certainly when I work with female clients who are talking about, very difficult relationships he'd had with men, I may say, if I felt there was a tension or a barrier being created, and rightly so. I mean, some clients don't have great experiences of men, and some clients don't have great experiences of women. So just to balance it out, and I'd say I'm just wondering how easy it is to tell another man of this. And again, that kind of just turned the key. Sometimes they'd say, well, it isn't. And I'd say, okay, perhaps we just look at that. And it's all about managing the relationship and trying to keep that relationship buoyant, so it doesn't sink below transference and perception and misapprehension of things. So, yeah, being curious and being open, I think, is the greatest way of addressing that, Ken.
Yeah, and the word that comes to mind there is congruence. Saying it as it is rather than scooting around it. And what I'm finding really interesting as we're kind of developing this topic is the next element that I wanted to cover in terms of rapport. So how do we flex that rapport muscle, as it were? Because there's so many different elements of it. And of course, we just need to go to empathy, which we've already mentioned. Empathy is a great rapport builder. And we've just spoken about that congruence.
Oh, yes.
Can build rapport. Congruence is daring to be who you really are. And of course, we're encouraging clients to do the same. That's what therapy is about. Don't be how people want you to be you. And that involves a level of congruence. And of course, that unconditional positive regard, seeing that human that is in front of us for who they really are. So we go to those three facilitative conditions mentioned by Carl Rogers, and already we can see how they intertwine into building that relationship and creating that rapport. And of course, I kind of loaded this question, Rory, with going in and what happens if you're struggling with that rapport building. And you're 100% right in what you say, in that congruence and putting it out there. Another way is to exercise patience. Sometimes the person will need a little bit of time. It may be that many times in their life, anytime they've trusted in somebody, it has gone on to them being let down in the future. And it may take time, and we need to allow that time for that to develop. And you used a great example, Rory, and I too worked in a college for some time where there was a massive age difference between myself and the clients that were presenting. And, maybe I was seen slightly transferentially by them as a teacher or a member of staff or a member of the, and it took a little bit of time, and it was okay to give that time. And of course, my supervisor was where I took the feelings that came up in me, because if I'm feeling, hey, maybe the rapport is not building within this relationship, I need to identify, is that within me or is that within reality for this person? And taking that, of course, to supervision, having a critical friend, a peer who works with you and looks over that, somewhere you can talk about it, not just have it go around in your head, can be really, really helpful.
Yes, and I don't think we could end this topic, really, Ken, without talking about others or othering. So one of the biggest barriers, I think, to rapport is not being culturally aware, not having cultural competencies, or not being neurodiverse aware and having neurodiverse competencies, because people see through different frames of reference. Phenomenology just isn't down to our it's down to our experience, but it's also down to our experience of living in a world of difference. And if you're neurodiverse, or if you come from a specific culture, it may be that you feel that you're not understood by the person in front of you. And I had an interesting conversation with someone the other day, and he was saying that somebody went into a counselling service and said, "Do you counsel black people?" And the response was, we counsel everybody. And the person left. And of course, the response is, what is it specifically you're looking for? What is it that you need from therapy in a therapist? Because that is addressing that. If someone asks you that question, they're not asking the obvious question. Do you counsel everybody? They're asking you a specific question. Do you counsel people who understand me? And I think that is just the nuts and bolts of rapport.
Yeah, and 100%. And once again, you're being curious. You're putting out that welcome mat, and you're verbalizing it as opposed to presuming. And of course, we counsel everybody is very, it's quite flippant. And it's probably true. I guess the person was trying to be inclusive, but
yes,
I think it just points back to the CPD, personal development,
yes,
knowing who you are, and then that recognition that not every client is going to be a match for you.
Yes.
And that is really worth us realizing. And it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It can be transferential. They may see you as somebody from their past, and it may be too early in the session without having been able to build the rapport to be able to work with that in a respectful way. So I think there's a lot to this. And the interesting thing about rapport is it is something that it's a subject that is covered in the very beginning of counseling training. Right in that very early stages, you'll learn about the importance of rapport and rapport building. But again, it is a skill, and I do believe that it is a skill because we've spoken about how we can improve it, which makes it skillable. It can be practiced, and I think that as we mature as therapists, as we do our CPD, it is something that we should revisit often enough to remember it and not just see it as a basic and now a given. Rapport just builds as I have my sessions. Revisit rapport. I think that's the challenge. Revisit rapport, how it is built and how it looks. If you're in practice, have a think about your clients and think about how rapport is idiosyncratic, how it will differ from client to client. One person would maybe feel slightly different to another. It's a very, very interesting and powerful skill, Rory.
Yes, and just hearing us talking about it, I'm reflecting that it's quite easily dismissed as, rapport's just getting on with people. But as we've seen, there's just so much more to it. And it also speaks, I think, Ken, to deliberate practice. And deliberate practice is where you look at your entire skill set portfolio and you take time to focus on one particular aspect of that skill set and develop it and hone it. And you might do that in supervision. You might do that through CPD. But I think there is a tendency, maybe I'm being a little bit kind of judgmental here, but I think there's a tendency that once you've moved past that introduction course where you've learnt your basic skills, they're just a given. But maybe the challenge is to go back to them and just see if there's any other aspects, that you can put to those skills, because those skills make the difference.
Yeah, and it's kind of it's almost like the mortar. If the skills are the bricks, the building bricks of the counseling relationship, rapport is the mortar that is in between those bricks from the very first session to the very last session. It just weaves its way through. It is so important. If you're interested in reading more about rapport, maybe revisiting rapport as a qualified practitioner, then you need Rory's super duper handout that he's made on rapport building. And you can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com. That's our mother website. At the very top, you'll find the podcast tab. Go to episode 256. So even if you listen on Apple or Spotify or on a mobile application, Android mobile application, it's really worth going to counsellingtutor.com. to the episode page. It's 256. On that page are the show notes, loads of links that kind of expand on the topics that Rory and I speak about. And you can download free of charge a wonderful PDF that has been put together insightfully on building rapport right from that page. And of course, that is today's Theory in Practice. And as we move from theory and practice into practice today, this is our section where we take something that is contemporary, something that you might be speaking about within our Facebook group, something that may be a challenge that you're facing at the moment. And today, Rory, you've chosen the topic of transitional objects.
Yes, absolutely. And you mentioned the Facebook group. And if you are not a member of our Facebook group, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. We're a closed group, but knock on the door and our moderator will let you in, and you can join thousands and thousands of like-minded people, all talking about topics in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. We have students, we have qualified colleagues, we have supervisors and tutors, and there's some very interesting conversations that start up, and it's a very supportive group. So if you're not joined us, think about joining us, knock on that door and we'll let you in. And one of the topics that came in was transitional objects. And I've always been fascinated about transitional objects because over the last few years, I've been interested in child development, how children develop. And, one of the things that we know is attachment, that children have attachments, and attachments last a lifetime. And I was reminded about attachment and transitional object when my granddaughter came to stay the other week. My granddaughter's 3 and she loves staying with us, and she came in pulling a blanket behind her, and my wife looked at the blanket and she said, "That's going to go in the washer." And I said, "No, don't put it in the washer." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because she's smelling it, and what's happening is she's smelling it, and the olfactory bulb, the little bumps of cells behind the nose, is picking that smell up, and it's triggering a hippocampus of memories of mummy, and that's self-regulating her." And my wife said to me, she said, "Why is it every time we talk about something as simple as washing a blanket, you talk about counselling?" And I said, "Well, there you go. You married a therapist." And she carries a transitional objects. And, have a think, if you're listening out there, do you carry transitional objects? I mean, in the past, people used to carry lucky rabbits' feet. I mean, they weren't very lucky for the rabbit, I have to say. But, people carry things. It might be a key. It might be a stone. It could be anything. And if you are carrying it, it's almost certainly it's regulating you in some way. So a transitional object is an object that helps the client self-regulate when they're away from therapy. And certainly clients who may have had difficult childhoods may need some form of self-regulation. So I think it's really interesting. And therapists sometimes, when there's breaks, may give an object or a stone, maybe a stone on the table for the client to take away if they want, to remind themselves of what was done in therapy and to regulate themselves.
Very much so. I love the story of your granddaughter and the blanket, and it reminds me of when we got our puppies. So when we got our puppies, we would pick them up from the breeder, and they would come home, and they would come home with a toy or a piece of material or a small blanket that had the smell of mum on it, and it helps the puppy transition into the new environment, into the new home. Seems to be kind of baked into our psychology, transitional objects, not just ourselves as humans, but animals as well, certainly puppies, and I can relate to it there. And I look to my daughter. She wouldn't mind me telling this, because she's very, very proud of this. She's had a little like doggy teddy bear that she's had since she was a little baby, before memories were formed. She still has it today. And when she goes away with her university on trips where she needs to go and do field work, and she's going to be away for a few days, what does she take with her? She takes her little teddy doggy with her. It's a transitional object. It's something to hold on to have a link to. On my desk right now in front of me, and if you're watching this on YouTube, because we do have the Counselling Tutor Podcast on YouTube, if you haven't seen it, go onto YouTube, put in Counselling Tutor Podcast, and you'll see it. I'm holding up my transitional object here. It's a little stone that was given to me by my wife from a retreat that she went on, and it's got the word peace kind of engraved in it there. And that's a transitional object for me. I pick that up on a daily basis, and I'll hold it, and it means something to me. But at the end of the day, it's just a stone. It's the meaning that I attribute to that. And that's what a transitional object is. It is a meaning that is kind of attributed to an inanimate object by our client, and it can be really helpful. So an example of a transitional object, you've already mentioned, Rory, it might be a stone or something on the table. It may be that you do some work with the client, miniatures work. So miniatures work is a little baby car, a feather, and a number of small little items that are in a box, and you ask a client to choose one of those and think about why they chose it. And very often a client might choose something and then start recounting their journey or where they're at, using the object to kind of reframe on. And that would make a great transitional object, where you'd say, well, if we're not going to be seeing each other for a while, we've got the Christmas break or whatever it is, you take that, hold on to it, and think about what that meant to you. And when and it gives a connection, an anchor. It's almost like an invisible thread that binds.
Absolutely, Ken. And it's interesting, we've talked about inanimate objects, obviously ones that are incredibly special and important, but actually transitional objects can be ourselves as therapists. There's some very interesting literature around how therapists can be transitional objects. And I'm reminded that a couple of months ago, I got a surprise phone call from a student who became a former colleague, and who became a colleague of mine. We talked together, we team talked together, and she phoned me up and she said to me, "Oh, how are you doing, Roy?" I said, "I'm great, you know, good to speak to you and all that." And she said, "I was with a client the other day and I thought, what would Rory do? What would Rory do?" And I thought, I said, "Was that helpful?" And she said it was, because she didn't tell me exactly what was happening, but it sounded like there was a decision to be made, and maybe they were getting a bit nervous about it, and then they thought about me, and miraculously they managed to work their way through. But that was it. It was a self-soothing idea. What would Rory do? You know, being held, if you like, by the tutor, reminding her of the times maybe in the case discussion groups in when we were teaching. And I think that's really useful. And I think, you know, sometimes we underestimate how much of a transitional object we are in therapy, where clients may say, "Oh, I've often heard people say, I remember my therapist." That's a transitional object. And I think one of the most underrated transitional objects is sometimes not used in endings. So, you know, we get clients who say, I'm not sure about an ending. And I read a wonderful therapist's account of how she would ask her clients to draw pictures of the work they've done and how they've grown, a representation of how they've grown in therapy. And they would do this work maybe over the last couple of sessions. At the end, the therapist would bring a little plastic A4 briefcase, you know, the sort of things you find at little bookshops and things. And the client would put all those documents in and carry them off into their lives.
That's beautiful.
and it's absolutely beautiful. And I know that, you know, when I work with children, they do pictures. And I'd say, what do you want to do with the pictures? I'll keep them. Oh, and I've got that picture on my wall. And my supervisor would say, you do realize that's a transitional object. That's a way of self-regulating. So, I think it's a bit of an underestimated idea, transitional objects. But if you are listening out there, I bet you can recount times when, having listened to this, you've either given a transitional object or you've been a transitional object.
Very, very much so. And we'd love you to take part in this discussion and expand on this discussion, share what you have used, and get into the Facebook group. As Rory said, you just go to Facebook, put in Counselling Tutor, knock on the door, come on in, join these conversations. What transitional objects might you use? Or maybe think, do you use transitional objects in your practice? Could you introduce transitional objects into your practice? And it's interesting, what things can become transitional objects. My wife can't go for a walk without coming back with a stone or a piece of wood from the walk. We're kind of drawn to those kind of things. And then when I say why, she says, because it reminds me of the beach. Well, so do the other 20 stones on the window. That's just my...
I hope she's not listening to this, Ken.
No, oh, she is. I'm in so much trouble. But I'm saying this, of course, with great love and jest. So it's like I think back to, I worked in a company that I then left. But I had their pen with the logo on. And years later, I took it out and I thought, oh, right, yes, I worked there. And it took me back and it was a revisit. It transported me back to a time and a place, to emotions and memories. And I think that is so, so powerful that an object can do that. And as you said, Rory, not just an inanimate object. I guess in a way, as therapists, are we being a transitional object to that person? How often might a client say something like, I thought, what would my therapist advise me to do right here? Yeah. In a way, we're there as that transitional object, as part of ourselves. What a powerful topic, Rory. Thank you for bringing that.
Yeah, and I just pick up on that. What would my therapist advise me to do? I think that sometimes what happens is part of, even though we're non-directive in our therapy, what happens is that voice of the therapist then becomes the internal voice of the client, who then says, "This is what I'm going to do." And when the client says, "What would my therapist advise me to do?" I would usually kind of, when I was a younger therapist or a less experienced therapist, pick up on that and say, well, I don't give advice. Nowadays, I would just think that's their internal voice asking that question, what should I do? And within that, there is growth.
I love that. I want to jump in on that before we end this topic, Rory. We speak about our own internal supervisor. We've spoken about it in previous podcast episodes, how when we are there with the client, we kind of might helicopter above what is being said and done. And part of our supervisor is with us in that room. We have this internal supervision process, and the same is with clients, So as you're speaking, Rory, what my therapist advise here, it is their own internal voice. We're not there. We're not advising them. And we may work in a non-directive way, but it is their way of linking that. And it is a healthy way of linking that, not disempowering, because it is their thought, it is their feelings, in the same way as if we are kind of flexing our internal supervisor, it might appear like, I wonder what my supervisor might suggest in this situation. And of course, as we mature, it stops being what might my supervisor suggest, and it just becomes a internal voice. Yeah. And hopefully with our clients too, as that matures, maybe it stops being what might my therapist do, and it's just part of their thinking and their processing and their reasoning and their emotional intelligence growing as they develop. And it links to transitional objects. There it is. That is practice today, where we look at something that is contemporary. And we now go into our next section, which is practice matters. This is the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor podcast. You can write this down on your CPD log as CPD. And today, Rory, an interview with Sean Connolly, TEAM CBT.
Yes, one of the things that really excites me is how therapy and therapeutic theories develop, evolve, and become more contemporary. And Sean reached out to me and said, he'd like to talk about TEAM CBT, a different approach to CBT, a developmental approach to CBT. I caught up with him, and this is what he had to say. One of the fascinating aspects of counselling theory and the way it's practiced is how theory develops. So I'm delighted to welcome Sean Connolly today, who's going to talk about a different concept or approach in CBT called TEAM CBT. So Sean, thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome, Rory, and thanks for having me.
So TEAM CBT, what's that all about then?
Yeah, I suppose it's a concept developed by Dr. David Burns. I'm a trained counsellor and also mental health professional. And I suppose I read Dr. David Burns' book maybe 20 odd years ago on CBT. It was one of the best sellers, Feeling Good at that time. And I hadn't thought much about it. I actually practiced one of the tools and occasionally would have brought in the client work, the mood log and daily mood record. And I noticed a number of years back he launched a podcast just describing actually how he uses his approach in practice. And I suppose it'd be best starting by explaining what TEAM actually stands for and what drew me to it. So T stands for testing. So basically, the idea, and I suppose this is well worn now in practice, thinking of Scott Miller's work and research and others, testing, you know what I mean, the client's mood at the start and end of sessions and charting if there's any progress, over time, and also testing, at the end of sessions, what was the therapeutic relationship like? Because what we've discovered and what Dr. Burns as well has discovered himself, but research backs this up, is that we're actually pretty poor at understanding our client's frame of mind. So we might think we've had a great session and it turns out the client doesn't think so, or vice versa. And secondly, maybe clients are actually getting worse over time, so or your performance is staying static. So how do you know if you don't measure? So then you can have those conversations with people. Look, I noticed that we've improved in this area, but I noticed your depression is getting worse. Do you want to tell me more about that? And that allows you to have those conversations. I'm not going to over-egg this, but I genuinely do believe, I've seen this in my own practice, that testing has saved people's lives, because I've seen clients come in and they're presenting in a certain way, and on the surface things look fine, and then I notice there's a box for suicide scores, and maybe that for that week has come up very, very high, and had they not done that measure, they could have easily passed over that during the session, and I would have sent them out at risk, basically, and that's really flagged up. So that's personally why I always use that. And so the T is the testing. That's the first part. The E, and I think this will be music to your ears, Rory, is empathy. Well, empathy, I don't need to say anything more in this podcast. You've done so many great episodes on it, but as we know, the therapeutic relationship's at the core of all counselling. Now, to the CBT, this might be a new concept, but whenever I hear empathy and Dr. Burns talk about it, I was like, the person-centred, people knew about this for decades. This has been talked about since the 60s. But I suppose it did resonate with me. I was like, yeah, and we know one of the critiques of CBT in particular is, can be thought of as manualised and robotic. And I have to say that's maybe a bit of a cliche about practitioners. Most are actually going to be very empathetic and caring. But it does draw that, and I suppose Dr. Burns recognises that. And very much he's of the opinion, you must understand what's going on for the client, because otherwise you could be working on the wrong problem, or they'll not open up and work with you. So if the empathy is not there, you can probably forget the rest. Now, the old chestnut, and again, I think it might be, I'm paraphrasing news here, I may have heard this in the podcast, but we certainly thrashed out in the literature as well, is we know empathy is certainly necessary, but is it sufficient? And that, for me, was always the question. It is great, it's fantastic, but is it enough to get some people better? I think some people will. You give the core conditions and can work through it, and you can certainly see massive progress. But for others, there sometimes needs to be a bit more than that. And I suppose Dr. Burns' opinion in and of itself is that empathy in and of itself isn't enough. With the exception maybe of what he describes as sort of issues like grief, for example, where you're not necessarily going to go and do change work. You just need to be there with them. So the third part then that he's recognised is A, which stands for Assessment of Resistance. So TEA, or agenda setting was another word, but it can be quite confusing because it's not the agenda setting that we traditionally hear about in CBT. This is actually assessing a client's resistance. Okay, and again, resistance, therapeutic resistance, you're quite aware of as well, I'm sure, and I've heard podcast episodes on the same. But this is actually looking at if somebody's depressed or anxious, what might be great about that? Why might a person not want to give up? And I'll maybe pose that question, being cheeky, Rory. If you had an anxious patient, say for example, an anxious counselling student, and they're coming to you, I'm really frightened and anxious about my upcoming assignments, I can't sleep at night. What might that say that's great about that student? Why might they be reluctant to give that up?
Well, possibly because they are committed to doing it, and part of being committed is maybe generating some anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely, spot on. And this might sound simple, but it actually can be mind-blowing for people, because very often you can wrestle with somebody. They'll come, I'm really anxious, I really want help with my assignments and I can't sleep at night, and then you're trying to get them to de-escalate and to regulate their emotion, and yet they'll go back out as anxious as ever. And it's not because they don't want to get better, but the anxiety is actually serving them. So we're actually voicing the resistance and bringing it out to the fore. This is what anxiety does for you. And do you really want to deal with this? Because what happens if you get so relaxed? Do you end up not doing your homework or your assignment? So what we would often talk about is we would negotiate with the resistance, nearly the parts, so party wants to hold on to it and party wants to let it go. So instead of actually removing the anxiety, what about we dial it down so that it's at a point where you still have enough to function and to get all those great benefits. It's not that there's something wrong with you, you're just a high performer and want the best. And, but at the same time, at the minute it's too overwhelming, can we dial it down? Or maybe a client might say, you know what, I don't want to get rid of my anxiety, it's actually serving me quite well, it's very uncomfortable, but I'm not ready to work at it. Because one of the big things with anxiety that we particularly talk about in CBT is the second part of resistance is the process. Now, with anxiety in particular, the belief is you always have to eventually expose yourself to the thing you're frightened of. And for a lot of people, they don't want to do that, for good reason. So I'll take a classic example of a phobia. We can say, look, I'll really empathise with you, understand you've that fear of spiders or snakes or whatever, keeping it quite plain at this stage. But ultimately, we can talk about it all you want, but at some point you're going to have to face this fear. And for a lot of people, they don't want to do that. So again, you have to voice that, and say, well, look, are you prepared? What's the good reasons not to do that? And you nearly want the client arguing for change. What, this is really impacting my life. I'm going out into shopping centres and I'm running away because I see a small spider, for example, and I'm socially embarrassed and I'd have to deal with it. Or you know what? It could be the opposite. But spiders don't really bother me. I just don't like them. So I get somebody to remove them from the house and I don't really fancy having to touch them. So you know what? I'm just going to leave it. And that's okay. So the hardest bit, what Dr. Burns would talk about, is sitting with open hands. And this is whereby he talks about the number one therapeutic error. I'll maybe pose this again to you, Rory, just to be cheeky, but what do you see as the number one therapeutic error, or do you have any guess of what?
Well, I would think the number one therapeutic error is that therapists impose their views onto the client. In other words, they hear the client and then they think, well, this is what we have to work on. And with that, they kind of diminish the client's autonomy.
Yeah, well, you're not far off. I have to say you may have read ahead in this. He puts it just the number one therapeutic error is actually clients wanting to help. Or not clients, sorry, counsellors wanting to help. So rushing in to help.
Rescuing.
And that used to kind of fry my brain. I was like, well, of course you want to help. Like, why else are you doing this job? I genuinely want to see people get better. Like, it's pivotal, like that they get better. Otherwise, why would it be here? And it's horrendous to see suffering. But very often we overdo it then because, as you say, take away the client's autonomy. And the client might have good reason to hold on to this. Maybe the issue they're dealing with, depression, for example, maybe they've lost somebody that they love dearly, and at the moment they're just not ready to deal with that. So us rushing in to try and solve and pull in methods, like if you were a CBT practitioner, to take this away, well, that person just mightn't be ready, or we might need to look at a different approach to help them navigate that grief. or the anxiety, as we say, like rushing in, well, I'll take that anxiety away from you, and let's see how we deal with it. But then how do they motivate themselves? So it's understanding that and being able to sit with open hands if a client says, look, I really don't want to work at this at the moment. And that can be hard for us. And that's, I suppose, our own counter-transference reaction is maybe stuff we need to go in process. It sounds easy, but it's actually very difficult to do, to watch people suffer. And then the M stands for methods. So TEAM, M is the methods. And Dr. Burns has over 50 of them, but he practices pretty much, again, it's not new stuff to us. I'm sure I've heard you talk about it on the podcast as well. Pluralistic counselling, and Dr. Burns talks about tools, not schools of therapy. So not to get hung up and very precious on a method. You try a method, if it doesn't work, okay, perfect. Let's try the next one. And he's 50 of them. That doesn't mean you have to just stick with his. There's tons of other methods from other schools of therapy that you can draw on. But once you have the bedrock of the TEA, you've tested, you've empathized, really, and that might take a number of sessions, and you've assessed the resistance, then you find the methods bit comes easy. Do you know what I mean? And his belief is once you find a method that works, it generally will always work for that person. So what might work for me might be something different for you. And there's a period of practice to learn those methods as well.
I mean, it sounds like, although you come from the CBT school, I guess, it sounds to me like this is broadly applicable to any form of therapy, really.
Yeah.
Because, the testing is to kind of get the feedback off the client, what they've decided to, is it working? Empathy, is a very important factor, I think, in any therapeutic encounter. And I just pick up on the necessary and sufficient conditions. The actual complete sentence is necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic change. And my view is that you can get some therapeutic change. You might get all the client needs with empathy, but there may be other unexplored areas of change which a different modality may better serve. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's the idea. It's not getting precious on modality. Do you know what I mean? That you're able to be flexible and integrative for the client. Now, I suppose I'm coming at it more from a person-centered sort of integrative approach. The CBT has always interested me, but my main training's in counselling. Hence, I'm a counselling tutor as well, and hence why I was drawn to your podcast. I always refer my students to it. So I would be coming from that background. But even the CBT aspect, you could nearly leave it off because it's the TEAM. The methods could be any approach. For example, I'm learning EMDR at the moment, which I have to say I'm raving about, and could do another podcast on that. But that would be, I would still be doing the TEA, and then my methodology for some patients might be, or clients might be the EMDR of a specific trauma.
So one question I'd like to clarify, there's a lot of discussion about third wave CBT. Would the TEAM model fit into that idea of third wave, where the Beckian style of CBT, which is possibly more kind of mechanistic, for want of a better phrase, is enhanced by a more relational and thoughtful approach to the client's actual needs?
Yeah, well, I suppose the third wave, so Dr. Burns was one of the original, I suppose, quote-unquote disciples or students, actually, I should use, of Beck. So he would have trained with Beck in the early days, and then went on and wrote his own books. So he would be coming from that wave. Now, third wave, from my understanding, and there's a wee bit of controversy recently, because he very much doesn't subscribe as much to the meditation sort of and mindfulness school, because he believes you have to get a change in the thought. It has to be a sufficient change in the thought itself. However, a lot of the practitioners bring in their own ways and means. So a lot of our practitioners that we train with are maybe coming from schools like ACT, Acceptance Commitment Therapy, and they're bringing in that as part of the methodology. So as I say, anything really can go here, with respect, and you bring in your own way of being and your own methodology. And just on that, just to let people know that we do have a training group. So this started out in the US, where Dr. Burns would have trained people free in Stanford. But obviously now with COVID and online, he's his own podcast and he does live therapy. You can listen to it on it. It's become more available. So a group of us actually got onto the US training with his podcast host, Rhonda Borowski. And then we in turn realised there's a cohort in UK interested in this. Some are CBT, some are just coming from, I suppose, various schools like GPs of therapy, and then there's quite a few of us person-centred and integrative trained as well. So we meet on a Tuesday online and practice these skills. It's just an informal group that meets online. It's starting to grow, and hence why I suppose I want to come on and talk about it. People want to learn the skills. There's a free group that we're teaching these. And in particular, what I love about his work is the empathy. One of the critiques of empathy is, how do you do empathy? How do you teach empathy? He talks about the 5 secrets. And I must say, they're not secret, obviously, but I must say they are so applicable and useful for actually teaching people how to empathize, with skills. And you actually go away and practice these again and again and again, and you get better at them over time. I found that's really helped me with my own practice. My day-to-day work has actually been better empathizing. And one of the critiques, again, sorry, just to mention, you'd mentioned about the third wave as well, is sometimes these big concepts, put about and some of these things, different theories, and he can be come across a bit blunt with people whenever he's trying to learn these, and what does that mean? And I thought that's a bit condescending, like this is obviously another school of thought. But when I spoke to a fellow practitioner, he said some of these big concepts and big theories, what do they actually mean in practice? And I think that's what Dr. Burns is very good at, is actually distilling, well, what is empathy? How do you actually do it? So he breaks it down into the minutiae. It might sound very simple and basic, but I think that's the genius in it. It's like, yes, it is. It's easy to understand the way he words it, but can actually be quite hard to master, So I don't know if that makes any sense to you.
It does. And as we come to the end of this podcast, I found this a fascinating insight into a therapy that is well known, well developed, well researched, well documented, but a different aspect to it, and I think that's really, really useful. So I will say, Sean Connolly, thank you so much for joining us.
And thanks so much, Rory, for having me. And if anybody wants to find out more, we've got a Team Feeling Good UK website, and they can happily join in with one of our groups as well. We'd love to have you. There
we go. We'll put some links into the show notes on the Counselling Tutor page, and people can jump off from there. So thank you very much.
Massive thank you to Sean, a massive thank you to you, Rory, for reaching out, finding the right people to bring the interesting topics here. This has been the Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 256.
Yes, we started out by theory and practice. We talked about building rapport, why it's important to oil the wheels of the relationship, I think, Ken, or grease the wheels of the relationship to build a therapeutic alliance. In practice today, we talked about transitional objects that help us self-regulate, and objects that may ameliorate stressful or worrying times for us as we grow and develop as people. And then finally, in Practice Matters, caught up with Sean Connolly on Team CBT, developments in CBT. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.